We go. Welcome, Grant Clowers. Grant is a licensed clinical social worker and supervisor at Carson Tahoe Behavioral Health Services here in Carson City. As you can see, he specializes in mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy practices, and he has graciously volunteered to be a part of this important conversation for the next 3 weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Grant. Grant, thank you so much and welcome aboard.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here. So I want to start off with one of my favorite stories. I got this story from a very famous research psychologist at Harvard named Ellen Langer. And she tells the story at the beginning of one of her books, and I just want to paraphrase this story to you. So imagine that it's 2:30 in the morning and you are sound asleep in your bed and you hear the doorbell ring and you wake up, you stumble downstairs to the front door and you open the door and there's a guy standing at the front door. He's dressed to the nines. You look beyond him and at the curb is his Rolls Royce with his chauffeur waiting for him. And the guy says to you, this is so ridiculous. I am so sorry to wake you up in the middle of the night like this, but I am on a scavenger hunt and I am playing against my ex-wife and it's really, really important to me that I win. And you say, okay, what are you looking for? And he says, I'm looking for a piece of wood, and it needs to be 2 or 3 feet wide and 6 or 7 feet long, because it'll just fit in the back of my Rolls Royce. And the guy says, I know this is just ridiculous. I'm so desperate. If you can get that for me, I'll pay you $10,000 right now. And you think to yourself, boy, I could really use the 10,000 bucks. Let me think. You think about what's in your basement. You think about what's in the backyard. You can't think of anything that's a piece of wood that meets those parameters. And you think, well, could I go and get it? Well, not at 2:30 in the morning. And so after a bit, you say, I'd love to help you, but I don't think I've got anything like that. And the guy says, okay, I'm really sorry to have bothered you. I hope you can get back to sleep. So you go back upstairs, you go back to bed, and you're kind of thinking, boy, I could have used that 10,000 bucks. You finally go to sleep. The next morning, you get up, you go through your routine, you're going to work, you walk out the front door, and as you close the front door, you look at the front door, and you say to yourself, holy cow, a door is a piece of wood. It's about 3 feet wide and about 6.5 feet tall. And I would gladly have given up a $300 door for $10,000. So the question is, given that there was actually a lot on the line, why didn't this person see the front door as a piece of wood? Well, the reason why they didn't see it as a piece of wood is because they were seeing it as a door. And so the way that our brain works as human beings, our brain constantly puts everything that we experience into a category. And sometimes the categories are very accurate and helpful. Sometimes they're not so accurate and not so helpful. But sometimes they're actually accurate, but not helpful. And so when we think about this, the two basic categories that our brain puts stuff in is, if this is happening, I'm either okay or I'm not okay. And when we think about losing a job, we would actually say it doesn't just feel like it's not okay. It probably feels like a catastrophe. And so I'm going to make the case to you today that seeing losing a job as a catastrophe is probably pretty accurate, but may not be so helpful. And so what we're going to look at is it possible to see something as both a loss and to see it as an opportunity? Our brain isn't so good at shifting focus from catastrophe to opportunity, but the good news is that that's actually something that human beings can do and that actually we can help each other do. So when we think about a catastrophe, one of the basic things, as it says here on the PowerPoint, is that can be catastrophic is when we experience some kind of change or loss that really affects our identity, our sense of who we are. So just as something really good can temporarily give us a really positive sense, something negative can give us a really negative sense of identity. And the fact of the matter is, as it says here, we live in a culture that tells us that to a large degree, our identity is pretty largely dependent on our career. So very often, if someone were to ask you, "Oh, tell me about yourself," very often one of the very first things that you would say is, "Well, this is what I do for a living." And it's interesting, just even that language tells us something. We might not put it, "Here's my job." It's what I do for a living. It is my living. In fact, we often even call our job our living because we really tend to identify with our job. So the idea here is that the loss of a job or moving to a lesser job can actually make a pretty big impact on how people not only feel, but how they feel about themselves. Okay, next. So the way that our brain works is whenever we've had what we consider to be a failure or a problem or a loss, the natural thing that our brain does emotionally is we go to a sense of stress. There is this weird thing about the way that our brain works, and that is the more stressed we are, the more our sense of reality starts to narrow. So the more upset we are, the less likely we are to see options. And so as librarians, what I'm going to make a guess is that people are going to come to you looking for resources. They're going to come to you looking for help. And they're not going to be thinking very clearly because they maybe have just lost their job, or maybe they've lost that job and they're having to take a much lesser job. And so emotionally, their brain is going to be in a stress state. And what that means is they're not going to be thinking clearly, and they're not going to be likely to be seeing this as an opportunity instead of a loss. Now, one of the ways that I like to put this is being able to take something that is a loss and shifting your focus and seeing it as an opportunity. At first, that kind of sounds like what I call psychotherapeutic BS. In actuality, it is the path to happiness. One of the things I always like to tell people is there are two paths to happiness. One path is to only have good things happen, and the other path is to know how to deal with bad things when they happen. And unfortunately, our brain isn't always great at dealing with bad things when they happen. So when we most need to be thinking clearly and to be hopeful, it's when our brain tricks us into being stressed and maybe even hopeless. Okay, next. So here's the basic idea that when someone is in a really bad shape and they're coming to you for help, um, they are literally likely to be coming to you when what it is that they most need as an internal resource to be able to think clearly and see options, their brain is going to be really uncooperative with that. And so this is actually where you can come in. The fact that you can give them resources and the fact that you can help them to think clearly, it's not just information, it's actually a great gift that you're giving them. You are giving them something that maybe in that moment they can't give to themselves, which is the ability to think outside the box and to find resources and to be able to think a little bit more clearly. The therapy that I am most trained in, one of the things that they ask of therapists is, when you're looking at the client opposite you, are you seeing them as a problem to be solved, or are you seeing them as a sunset? That is, are you seeing them as something beautiful and wonderful with a great deal of options? And so that's actually something that you can offer them that maybe they can't offer themselves. Okay, so willing to take any comments or questions?
Wow, thank you, Grant. Thank you so much for that. And I will just look at the chat here. Does anybody have any comments or questions for Grant right now? Jump in. Okay.
Okay, so over the next couple of weeks, we're just going to look at some kind of more practical details. Obviously, the information, that's something you're already a specialist at. And so what we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks is how can you not only give information, but also do it in such a way that might help them to calm down and be able to think a little more clearly. In other words, how can you not only give informational support, but also maybe without trying to be a therapist, also kind of be present in an emotional way that they find supportive as well.
That is fantastic. And Grant, one of the things that I'm going to add this to the chat right now, it is this study was just released yesterday, and it actually, oops, hang on, everybody. I have a hard time doing two things at once. Okay, let's see if that goes in there. There it is. This was a study that was released yesterday. A researcher by the name of John Horrigan, who has worked for the FCC. He helped stand up the National Broadband Infrastructure Plan, and he also worked for the Pew Research Center for a period of time. He wrote a piece for the Benton Institute, which is it's a think tank about broadband in society. And essentially, this study talks about looking at a large segment of the job market where there is great demand, but an insufficient number of workers with the right level of digital and STEM skills. This piece talks about some of the efforts that are happening at the community level that can help address what the needs are. And there's actually a focus on some of the work that's happening in the state of Nevada. So when you look at this study, you'll see that he talks about that the estimate right now is that somewhere between 32 and 42% of all jobs that have been lost at this point across the country will not come back due to automation and due to other delivery models of services and goods and things. So I highly recommend that that you take a look at this study, because it definitely bears on what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. And then also, just to remind everybody that the archive of resources that complement each one of these talks from our clinicians and our subject matter experts can be found on the Nevada State Library website. When you go to the toolkit, where we have, yes, Sulin has the note here that there's a toolkit under our COVID-19 library resources. Each one of these monthly series are curated and organized, and then additional information is there. So further reading, discussion questions, if those of you who are hearing these things live would like to go forward and then take this learning onto your teams and with your groups. It's kind of a turnkey DIY. These sessions are recorded, so you could play that and then leap from there with internal discussions of your own. So we will have all of this up before next Tuesday from what we're talking about with Grant today, but the July series is complete if you go there now. So we certainly appreciate this. It's so well timed, and thank you, Grant. Thank you so much for setting the table for us. We know there's a lot ahead for sure. Let's see. Yeah. So
Okay, thanks.
okay.
Pleasure to be with you all. Look forward to seeing you next week.
See you next week, Grant.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.